All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're diving deep into subcontracting in the UK construction industry today. So if you're here, you probably need to get up to speed and fast on how this all works, right? We're going to make it easy for you. We're going to break down the essential principles and the practical side of things, the stuff you actually do on projects.
Yeah.
And we're basing this whole deep dive on a super detailed RICS guidance note. It's from April 2021 and lays out all the good practices that RICS members should be following.
Yeah, it's definitely a big one to get your head around. So at the most basic level, subcontracting is basically when you've got your main contractor, and that could be you listening right now, and they bring in another company, the subcontractor, to handle part of the project, maybe even all of it, the stuff laid out in the main contract. And, it's so common, it's practically standard practice. The guidance note actually points out that subcontractors often handle a massive, 85 to 90% of the actual value of those big main contracts. That's a huge chunk of the work.
Absolutely massive. So we want to make sure you come away from this with a crystal clear picture of how it all works. And to do that, we're going to follow the structure of that RICS guidance note step by step. First up, we've got the general principles, the kind of foundational knowledge, the knowing stuff. Then we'll move on to the practical side, how it all plays out in the real world, the doing. And finally, we'll wrap up with some really important practical considerations, kind of the advising aspect, the things to really keep in mind. So let's jump right in. What's the scope of this guidance note? What exactly does it cover? And maybe more importantly, what does it not cover?
Right off the bat, the guidance note makes it clear that it's really focusing on those tricky situations that can pop up when you're dealing with subcontracting on those really big major projects. But, and this is important, the core ideas and the practical stuff they talk about, it's all relevant to smaller projects too. Anything within the UK building and civil engineering world, really. But, and there's always a but, right? There are some things they specifically don't cover. They don't really get into the nitty-gritty of managing subcontractors day-to-day once they're already on site. And they also don't cover situations where the contract is basically just for supplying materials. Like, if there's no installation or actual work involved, that's not really what this guidance is about.
Good to know where the boundaries are, right from the get-go. Okay, so let's get back to basics for a second. What exactly is a subcontractor? And what do we even mean when we say subcontracting? We've kind of danced around it, but let's really define it nice and clear.
Exactly. Let's break it down. So, as we've said, a subcontractor is basically another company that the main contractor brings on board. They're responsible for doing a specific piece of the work, or sometimes, even the whole thing, whatever is outlined in that main contract. But here's the thing you absolutely can't forget. Even if, most of the work is being done by subcontractors, the main contractor, they're still the ones who are ultimately responsible to the employer. The buck stops with them. There's no passing the blame if things go wrong.
Gotcha. So the main contractor can't just delegate and disappear. That makes sense. Now, from a, legal standpoint, are main contractors usually allowed to bring in subcontractors whenever they want? Or are there rules around that?
Generally, they've got pretty free rein. The guidance points out that it's usually totally fine to include subcontracting arrangements in those contracts, unless, and this is a big unless, the main contract specifically says you can't. And you know what? Those kinds of explicit bans on subcontracting, they're actually pretty uncommon. You don't see them that often in the standard contracts that everyone uses.
That's interesting. So it seems like subcontracting has become a fundamental part of how the construction industry works. Has it always been this way? Was there a point where it all kind of, took off? A little bit of historical background might be helpful.
Yeah. If you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the real boom in subcontracting in the UK, in construction at least, started back in the 1960s. There are a few reasons why this happened. First, you had this new tax, the selective employment tax, and that actually made it cheaper for contractors to hire people who were self-employed. And who were those self-employed folks? Often subcontractors. Then on top of that, technology in construction, it started advancing like crazy. Projects got way more specialized. You needed people with really specific skills, niche expertise, and main contractors that didn't always have all those specialists on their payroll. And then, of course, projects just became more and more complex. So breaking down the work into smaller, more manageable chunks, it just made sense. It's easier to handle.
Yeah, breaking things down into bite-sized pieces. That makes sense. So it sounds like there's a whole ecosystem of subcontractors out there. Are there any key organizations or groups that people in the industry should know about? Who are the big players in the subcontracting world?
Absolutely. There are a couple of big names to keep in mind. First off, you've got Build UK. They represent a ton of different specialist street associations, over 30, I think, so they have a pretty broad view of the whole sector. Then there's SEC Group, and they specifically focus on representing the interests of specialist contractors. These groups, they do a lot of really important work. They advocate for their members, they help set best practices, and they really shape how the industry works overall.
It's good to know who's looking out for everyone's interest. Okay, so now we've got a good grasp on what subcontracting is and how it became such a big part of the industry. But like anything, there are pros and cons. What are the main advantages for the main contractor? Why use subcontractors so much?
From the main contractor's point of view, there are some pretty compelling reasons, honestly. We touched on a few already. Access to specialist skills, for one. You don't have to have every single expert on staff. You can just bring in a subcontractor who specializes in that thing. And it gives you a lot of flexibility, with your workforce. You can scale up or down as needed. No need to have people on the payroll when there's no work for them. And then there's the whole risk thing. You can actually transfer some of the contractual risk onto the subcontractor, which strategically can be a smart move. And don't forget, using subcontractors well can actually make your forecasting and cash flow way better, easier to manage, and it can even save you money on training because the subcontractor, they're responsible for making sure their own people are trained and qualified. Oh, and one more thing the guidance note mentions is that main contractors can kind of indirectly benefit from those government incentives that are aimed at small businesses, SMEs. Because guess what? A lot of subcontractors fall into that category. So it's not just about filling a gap, it's about being more efficient, more competitive without having all those specialist skills in-house all the time. But of course, you've also got to manage that reliance, make sure it works for you.
Yeah, relying on others always comes with its own challenges. So let's flip the coin. What are the downsides? What are the risks that come with using subcontractors so much?
Yeah, there are definitely some potential downsides. One of the big worries is that it can actually lead to a fragmentation of skills. And this can actually hurt the entire construction industry. If main contractors aren't developing those skills in-house because they're always just bringing in subcontractors, well, those skills might start to disappear over time. It's a long-term concern. And then, of course, you lose a bit of control, right? You're not directly overseeing every single detail of the work, every method, so there's a potential risk to quality. And then there's this thing called risk dumping, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's basically pushing a whole bunch of contractual risk down onto the subcontractor. And while that might seem great for the main contractor in the short term, if you push too much risk down, you can end up with subcontractors who are in a really shaky financial position, and that actually increases the risk for everyone involved. It can lead to disputes, delays, all sorts of problems. And then there's the potential that the main contractor, they kind of miss out on learning opportunities. If they're not directly involved in all aspects of the work, they might not learn as much from each project, and that can hurt them in the long run.
Risk dumping. That's a term I've definitely heard before. It sounds like a recipe for tension and instability, for sure. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the different types of subcontractors you might come across. The guidance note, it breaks them down into different categories, right? I think understanding those differences is really important.
It is. So first off, you've got what they call nominated subcontractors. These are kind of unique because they're actually chosen by the employer, not the main contractor. Think of it like this. Imagine you're hiring a builder to renovate your house, and you specifically say, I want you to use this specific kitchen fitter. That kitchen fitter, in this scenario, they'd be like a nominated subcontractor. Then you have named subcontractors. It's similar, but not exactly the same. In this case, the employer might suggest or name a particular subcontractor. Maybe they've had a good experience with them before, but it's the main contractor who actually goes and makes the contract with them. And finally, you've got domestic subcontractors. These are the ones that the main contractor picks themselves, no input from the employer. They're like your regular, trusted tradespeople, the ones you work with all the time.
So the key difference there is who gets to pick them, how much, say, the employer has. Makes sense. Are there other ways to categorize subcontractors, like based on the type of work they do?
For sure. You can also categorize them by what they actually do. So there are works contractors. They're the ones who take on a whole chunk of the actual construction work, like a whole floor of a building or something. Then there are trade contractors, and that's probably the most common type you'll encounter. They specialize in a specific trade, like plumbers, electricians, carpenters, you name it. Then you've got labor-only subcontractors, and they basically just supply the workers, the people, without necessarily bringing any materials. And you know what? Even design consultants, they can be subcontractors, especially on those design and build projects where the design is happening alongside the construction.
I never really thought of designers as subcontractors, but that makes sense. Can we go back to those nominated and named subcontractors for a minute? I think I heard you mention Procedure 1 and Procedure 2 before, something from the JCT IC 2016. It was specifically related to nominated subcontractors. What's the difference between those two procedures, and why should people in the industry know about them?
The really interesting thing here is that it all comes down to responsibility. Where does the liability ultimately lie if something goes wrong? That's the key difference. So with Procedure 1, the main contractor, they actually have a bit less direct responsibility for the nominated subcontractor's design and how well they do their job. So if there's a defect and it's because of a design flaw from the nominated subcontractor, the employer might have to go directly after that subcontractor to get it fixed. The main contractor might be off the hook, more or less. But then, with Procedure 2, it flips. The main contractor ends up with more responsibility, even though the subcontractor was chosen by the employer. It's subtle, but it can make a big difference. And then, with named subcontractors, it's always clear. The main contractor is in charge, even if the employer suggested them. They're the ones on the hook for the named subcontractor's performance. So yeah, knowing the difference between those procedures, it's super important. It affects your liability, how much risk you're taking on, and how you need to manage those relationships.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Knowing where the responsibility lies is crucial. Okay, moving on in our knowing phase, the guidance note also talks about procurement and tendering. Can you give us a quick overview of what we need to understand here?
Yeah, sure. So in this context, procurement is basically just a fancy word for the whole process of getting the services or goods that a subcontractor is going to provide. It's everything involved in finding them, selecting them, and making sure they can do what you need them to do. And then tendering is the specific process of getting bids from different subcontractors and choosing the best one. It's like a competition, you know?
Yeah.
Who can offer the best price, the best quality, the best everything? And the guidance note really hammers home this point, that you absolutely need a solid procurement strategy. This is your plan for how you're going to find and engage subcontractors. It's the foundation for the whole process.
So it's all about planning ahead, having a clear roadmap. All right, that brings us to the last point in our knowing section. We're talking about the key features of a subcontract agreement. What are the must-haves? What should you expect to find in that document?
The subcontract agreement, yeah, that's like the Bible of the whole relationship. It needs to be super clear, no room for confusion. So first things first, it has to state the date the agreement was made. Then the full legal names of everyone involved, both the main contractor and the subcontractor. Of course, it needs a detailed description of the work that the subcontractor is actually going to do, the specific things they're responsible for. But beyond that, you'll usually find a bunch of other key elements. There's the main agreement document itself, which lays out the basic framework. Then there are the conditions of the subcontract, and those are often based on one of those standard forms we talked about earlier. Then you've got the particulars or the contract data. This is where you fill in all the specifics about the project, the details that make it unique. It's got things like addresses, the project schedule, a super detailed breakdown of the work involved, the payment terms, insurance requirements, how you're going to handle disputes if they arise, and whether there are any collateral warranties needed. Those are like guarantees for third parties. So yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive document. It covers all the bases.
Sounds like it. It's good to know all the essentials are in there. So we've covered the knowing. Now it's time to get into the doing. We're moving into the practical application of all these principles. And like we mentioned earlier, it all starts with a good procurement strategy. How does a main contractor actually go about creating one of those? How do you make it effective?
The number one rule here is alignment. Your subcontract procurement strategy, it has to be totally in sync with the bigger procurement strategy for the main contract. It's all got to work together. The guidance note actually lays out a pretty logical process for this. Usually you start with pre-qualification. That's basically checking if potential subcontractors meet the basic requirements. Do they have the right experience? The right certifications, the financial stability. Then, once you've got your shortlist, you issue what's called an invitation to tender, or ITT. That's the official document where you're asking them to submit their bids. Then you receive those tenders, you assess them carefully, and finally, you pick a winner. You select the subcontractor who best meets your needs based on whatever criteria you set out.
So it's like a multi-step process, starting with a broad pool and narrowing it down. And speaking of narrowing things down on big, complex projects, you often break the work down into smaller chunks, right? What are those called? Subcontract packages. How do you decide how to divide things up?
Exactly, subcontract packages. You got it. It's super common, especially on those massive projects. It just makes things more manageable. And there are a bunch of factors that play into how you decide to split things up. One big one is specialization. If you've got work that requires very specific expertise, like mechanical and electrical stuff, that often gets its own package. It just makes sense to keep things separate when you need different skills. And then the main contractor also needs to think about what they're good at, what they can handle in-house. If they've got their own specialists for certain things, they might not need to subcontract that out. And then, of course, relationships matter. If they've got subcontractors they already work with, people they trust and know do good work, they might try to package things in a way that keeps those relationships going. And lastly, they've got to consider the importance of each package. Some are more critical to the project's overall success, so they might need a more rigorous selection process, really making sure they get the best possible subcontractor. Other packages might be more straightforward, more transactional, so they don't need as much scrutiny.
So it's not just about splitting the work, it's about being strategic about it. Now, what about the employer? What role do they usually play in choosing subcontractors, especially for specialized work where they might have valuable input?
The guidance note is really clear on this. The employer should definitely have a say, especially when specialized work is involved. Their expertise is valuable. They want to make sure they're getting qualified and experienced people working on their project, especially for those critical parts that require really specific skills. So that's often why you see employers nominating or naming subcontractors. They're using their knowledge and experience to ensure a certain level of quality.
It's like a checks and balances system. Everyone has a role to play. Let's talk about getting subcontractors involved early in the project. I know the guidance note mentions something called early subcontractor involvement, or ESCI. What's the idea behind that, and what are the potential benefits and drawbacks?
ESCI is all about bringing those specialist subcontractors in early, sometimes even before the design is completely finished. And the idea is you get their expertise from the get-go. They can help shape the design, make sure it's buildable and efficient. And because they're involved so early, they can help spot potential problems and risks before they become big issues. And sometimes they can even suggest ways to save money, through value engineering. But there's a catch, and it's an important one. If a subcontractor is involved super early, and they're giving you all this input, it can actually be tricky to get truly competitive pricing later on. What if that subcontractor ends up being the best for the job, but their price isn't the lowest? It can be tough to balance the benefit of their early involvement with the need to get the best deal. It's a trade-off you have to consider.
A tricky situation, for sure. Sounds like you have to be very careful about how you manage that early involvement.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to the actual tendering process. Let's say you're a main contractor and you need to subcontract a package of work. What are the first steps in that formal tendering process? Where do you even begin?
First things first, you got to pick the right tendering procedure for the job. This depends on a lot of factors. What kind of work is it? How complex is it? How much risk is involved? And how many potential subcontractors are out there who could do the job? Once you've got that figured out, the next step is putting together and issuing that invitation to tender, the ITT. This is the official document where you're asking potential subcontractors to submit their bids. It's the starting gun, basically.
And what should be in that ITP? What kind of information do you need to include to make sure you're getting good quality bids from the subcontractors, bids that you can actually compare apples to apples?
A good ITT, it should be clear and comprehensive. It needs to start with a formal invitation, just stating that you're inviting them to tender. Then you need a super clear description of the work involved, no room for ambiguity. You also need to specify the exact format you want their tender to be in, so they're also getting the same information. And of course, you need a deadline. When do they have to get their bids in? And lastly, you need to give them very clear instructions on the whole process. How can they ask questions? How should they submit their final bid? All of that needs to be spelled out so everyone's on the same page from the start.
It sounds like communication is key. What happens after you send out the ITT? What if the subcontractors have questions? Or what if you need to make changes to the scope of work?
That's where things can get a little messy. But it's important to manage it well. First off, you got to give the subcontractors enough time to really digest all the information and put together a good bid. Rushing them is never a good idea. And during that time, they might have questions. They might need some clarification. You need to answer those questions quickly and transparently. And if you have to make changes to the ITT itself or to the scope of work, anything really, you have to tell everyone who got the ITT. This is usually done through what are called tender addenda. It's basically an official update, making sure everyone has the latest information and is bidding on the same thing.
So fairness is paramount. Everyone needs to have the same information. And then what happens? The bids come in. What's the next step for the main contractor?
Once the deadline hits, you got to gather all those tenders and start reviewing them carefully. And this needs to be a fair and transparent process too, ideally with a set procedure for opening those bids. Then, the main contractor, they have to check every single bid, make sure it's complete, that all the required documents are there, and they also need to look for any qualifications or assumptions the subcontractor might have made. Did they deviate from the ITT requirements? Did they make any special conditions? This is all about comparing those bids accurately and spotting any potential red flags that might cause problems later on.
So it's like a thorough inspection, making sure everything is in order. But what happens if you need to make changes after the bids are in? Like, what if you do some value engineering and realize you need to tweak the scope of work? Or what if something changes in the main contract that affects the subcontractors?
Yeah, changes after the bids are in, they're not ideal, but they happen. It might be to cut costs, to improve the design, or maybe to align with changes in the main contract. Whatever the reason, you got to handle it carefully. You need to be transparent with your preferred bidder, the one you're leaning towards, and discuss the changes with them. Often you end up negotiating a bit, figuring out how these changes affect things before you finalize the contract.
So flexibility and good communication are important. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the actual contract documents. I know there are a bunch of standard forms of subcontract in the UK. The guidance note actually lists quite a few of them. Can you give us a rundown of the most common ones and maybe tell us when you might use one over another?
Yeah, the JCT, the Joint Contracts Tribunal, they have a whole bunch of standard forms for subcontracts. They're kind of the go-to for a lot of projects. So first off, you've got the SBC sub, the standard building subcontract. This one is pretty common for straightforward building projects where the design is mostly set. Then there's the DB sub, the design and build subcontract. That one's specifically for projects where the subcontractor is doing a lot of the design work, not just the construction. And then for those really big, complex projects, you've got the MP sub, the major project subcontract. If you're somewhere in between, not a simple project, but not a mega project either, there's the IC sub, the intermediate subcontract, and then there's a special one called the ICS entity, the intermediate contract with a named subcontractor. That one's for when the employer has specifically named the subcontractor they want you to use. And then for those smaller, simpler jobs, you've got the JCT short form subcontract. It's less detailed, more streamlined. There's also the MWC subcontract, the minor works contract subcontract, again for smaller projects. And believe it or not, there's even a sub-subcontract form for when you've got subcontractors hiring other subcontractors. It's like a chain reaction. And lastly, there's the Services Agreement Specialist, PCSA. That one's for when you're hiring specialist consultants or contractors, folks who are providing a specific service.
Wow, that's a lot of options. It's good to have so many choices, I guess.
Yeah.
Are there any other standard forms out there that are commonly used in the UK?
Yeah, there are a couple more worth mentioning. The NEC4 Engineering and Construction Subcontract, or NEC4 ECS for short, is another popular one, especially for those big infrastructure projects and engineering-heavy jobs. It's a bit different from the JCT contracts. It focuses a lot on collaboration and working together proactively. And the guidance note also mentions the CE case subcontracts, which are more common in civil engineering, and the FIDX subcontracts, which you might see on international projects.
So yeah, lots of tools for different jobs. Once you've picked the right standard form, what are the key things you need to think about when you're actually writing up the subcontract agreement? What are the details that really matter?
Yeah, writing up that contract, it's all about the details. You got to be super careful, make sure everything is clear, and there's no room for misinterpretation. So first off, like we said, make sure you've got the right standard form for the project. Then you got to decide how you're going to pay the subcontractor. Is it a lump sum for the whole job? Or is it based on measuring how much work they actually do? And then, this is super important, you got to think about how the subcontract relates back to the main contract. This is where those back-to-back provisions come in. Basically, you want to make sure the subcontractor is bound by the same key obligations that you have with the employer, at least for the part of the work they're doing. So if the main contract has a clause about delays, you want the subcontract to have a similar clause. It keeps things consistent. And then, of course, there's the actual structure of the agreement itself. You need the date, the names of the parties, any background information, the main clauses outlining everyone's obligations, and a place for everyone to sign. And then you've got the particulars, or the contract data. This is where you fill in all the project-specific stuff. Addresses, schedules, a super detailed description of the work, payment terms, insurance details, how you're handling disputes, all of that. It's like customizing the template to fit your specific project.
It sounds like a pretty thorough document. No stone unturned. So the last step is actually signing the agreement, right? Making it official. Anything special you need to do at this stage to make sure it's all legally sound?
The big thing here is that it has to be properly executed, officially signed and sealed. Both the main contractor and the subcontractor have to sign the document, showing they agree to everything in it. That's what makes it legally binding, a real contract. Without those signatures, it's just a piece of paper.
So the signatures are what make it real. Okay, we've covered knowing and doing. Now we're moving into the final part of our deep dive, practical considerations, the doing advising part. This is where we get into some of the trickier aspects of subcontracting, the things that can really make or break a project. Let's start with technology. E-tendering is becoming more and more common, right? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, e-tendering is definitely on the rise. More and more companies are using online platforms to handle the tendering process. And it makes sense, it's way more efficient. You can distribute all the documents electronically, subcontractors can submit their bids online, and you get this clear, audible trail of the whole process. If there's ever a dispute, you can go back and see exactly what happened, who said what, when. It's all there in black and white, or I guess pixels on a screen.
Transparency is always a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, what about making sure you're working with a good subcontractor, one that's financially stable and knows what they're doing? The guidance note mentions securing the subcontractor. What does it mean in practice?
Basically, it means do your homework. Before you sign anything, before you commit to working with a subcontractor, you need to do your due diligence. Check them out, make sure they're legit, look at their financials, ask for references, and see what kind of experience they have. Have they successfully delivered similar projects in the past? Taking these steps can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Due diligence. It's like the background check of the business world. Okay, what about when you're working with subcontractors who are based outside the UK? Does that add any extra challenges?
Yeah, working with overseas subcontractors definitely brings its own set of complexities. The guidance note specifically mentions things like fluctuating exchange rates, which can really mess with your budget. And then, of course, you've got different legal systems and jurisdictions to deal with. It can get complicated, and you might need specialized legal advice to make sure everything is properly covered in the contract.
Sounds like you need to be extra careful in those situations. Let's talk about some of the specific problems that can pop up during a project. The guidance note mentions failure by the subcontractor to perform. That's the scary thought. How do you usually handle that kind of situation? What are the options?
Yeah, it's not a fun situation, but it happens. Thankfully, subcontracts almost always have specific clauses that address this. What happens if the subcontractor doesn't do what they're supposed to do? It could be anything, not working fast enough, delivering poor quality work, or just breaking the contract in some way. Those clauses usually outline a step-by-step process for the main contractor. They might start with a warning, then escalate to financial penalties, and in really serious cases, they might even have the right to terminate the contract completely and find a new subcontractor to finish the job.
So there's a whole escalation process, starting with a slap on the wrist and ending with a full-blown breakup. But what about the other way around? What if the main contractor doesn't pay the subcontractor on time? That's a problem too, right?
Absolutely. Late payments are a huge issue in the construction industry. And subcontractors, they have rights too. The guidance note points out that they usually have legal recourse, both through the contract itself and through legislation like the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act. If they're not getting paid on time, they can actually stop working, after giving proper notice, of course. And if the problem persists, they might even be able to terminate the contract and walk away. It's all about protecting their interests.
Fairness goes both ways. Okay, let's talk about some more legal terms. What about assignment and novation? They sound complicated, but I know they come up in contracts sometimes. What do they actually mean?
Yeah, they can be a bit confusing, but they're important to understand. Assignment basically means that one of the parties, either the main contractor or the subcontractor, they transfer some of their rights under the contract to someone else. Like, let's say a subcontractor needs cash flow. They might assign their right to get paid to a finance company. Novation is a bit more drastic. It's basically transferring all of your rights and obligations to a completely new party. It's like swapping one person out for another in the contract. This might happen if a company is sold, for example. The new owner might want to novate the existing contracts, so they're now the ones dealing with the subcontractors. Usually the contract will have clauses that say whether or not you can assign your rights or novate your obligations, and sometimes you need the other party's permission.
So it's all about who has the rights and responsibilities under the contract. And then there's another term I hear a lot, step-down clause. What's that all about?
A step-down clause is basically a way to make sure the subcontractor is playing by the same rules as the main contractor. It's a clause in the subcontract that says the subcontractor agrees to follow all the important obligations that the main contractor has under the main contract, at least for the part of the work they're doing. So if the main contract says the work has to meet certain standards, the step-down clause makes sure the subcontractor has to meet those standards too. It keeps everyone aligned.
Makes sense. Consistency is key. Now let's face it, even with the best contracts and the best intentions, sometimes disputes happen. What are the usual ways to resolve disputes in the construction industry? What's usually written into those subcontracts?
The guidance note mentions 3 main ways to handle disputes. First, there's adjudication. This is like a quick and dirty way to resolve things. It's relatively informal, and a neutral third party, the adjudicator, makes a decision that's binding, at least temporarily. Then there's arbitration. This is more formal, more private, and the decision is usually final. You're basically letting an arbitrator or a panel of arbitrators decide who's right. And then the last resort is litigation, going to court. That's the most formal option, and it can be expensive and time-consuming, but it's there if you need it. The subcontract will usually say which method you're going to use if there's a dispute.
So you've got options, from a quick resolution to a full-blown court battle. And lastly, let's talk about something that's always a risk in construction: subcontractor insolvency. What happens if a subcontractor goes bust? What does that mean for the main contractor, and what can they do to protect themselves?
Subcontractor insolvency, that's a nightmare scenario. It can really throw a wrench into the works. It can cause delays, cost overruns, all sorts of problems. You might have to scramble to find a new subcontractor to finish the work, and that can be expensive and time-consuming. So the guidance note really stresses the importance of having good contract clauses that address insolvency. What happens if it happens? Who's responsible for what? And it also says you got to do